fanatic over this game. I can eat it up. It's awesome.
I love it. I love getting to be something else and like creating this character.
It's a fun way to express yourself.
Talking pretty much non-stop for the past 96 hours. This is as important as music and movies. There's another way to talk and communicate.
It's a wonderful way of connecting with a lot of different people. It really changes a lot for you. It puts you into a different world, and it's just, wow, this is lovely.
When you engage something so deep, so dark, so personal, in that intimate kind of a way, you carry that with you wherever you are.
Here you are, an outsider, getting to play the ultimate outsider. All of a sudden you have different people that place different values on what is gaming. What is a role-playing game?
It was something that opened people's eyes to being able to express yourself in a whole different way.
This is one of the great secrets of pop culture of the 21st century.
Key moment of my entire life is when I first played Dungeons & Dragons.
Your dungeon master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run. Use your lightning bolt.
I was just instantly addicted.
Throughout the 70s and 80s, the most commercially successful role-playing games were all fantasy games. They were all, sort of variations on Lord of the Rings for the most part. You go on an adventure, you kill a dragon, you get some gold, and then you hit repeat. Dungeons & Dragons popularizing it.
Dungeons & Dragons has grown from an obscure hobby for an obsessed elite into a craze shared by an obsessed million or more.
Role-playing all through the 80s was something that was really big in contemporary culture. Literally millions of people were playing all the time. It allowed something quite new, which was a game that had a very strong narrative. And people would be getting into this so much.
It's surprising how much of your aggressions you can take out just by rolling dice trying to kill some monster.
Role-playing games were an opportunity to live the story, be an actor, tell a story, create drama.
Yeah. I think the role-playing we call it an art form, role-playing, and it's just unique. It's a unique experience.
I found Dungeons & Dragons at a very early age as a teenager, and we had a group that played, and it wasn't something we talked about. To admit to being a Dungeons & Dragons player or a role player, you risked social ridicule.
Role-playing games were not understood. It was new, and especially in the Deep South. You're a geek and a nerd for doing it.
Right, well, none of the cool kids played role-playing games. I think that is where I found more of a comfort level interacting with people.
I was the outsider. I was teased, not invited to birthday parties. That was my life,
Studio, the switch
part of the role-playing game hobby, and prior to everybody sitting down to play, somebody's got to have come up with a general storyline of what you're going to play through.
Always listen to it. Well, we appreciate that. All right. Thanks for calling me, okay?
And you can buy books that give you stories, or you can write your own. And so from an early point, we were creating our own story.
Stuart Wick, White Wolf's founder, he and his brother started a magazine. It was called White Wolf Magazine. The first couple issues look like they're stapled together, black and white paper, white line art. You look like something you'd see a high school freshman make out of his garage, because that's kind of not too far from the truth.
We pooled money ourselves, and we bought a box of photocopy paper, and I took that into the high school one day and asked for permission to use the photocopier in the front office, and they said, "Sure, Stuart." And so I printed my, demonic role-playing game magazine on the rural Georgia high school photocopier.
Yeah.
Initially, the sales on the magazine were nothing. We made like 100 copies of the first issue of White Wolf. We're not succeeding because this looks like a piece of garbage. There's a decision point to okay, if this is really going to be something we're going to continue to do, we've got to be more serious about it again. So that's the point at which we borrowed some money from our parents.
And that allowed us to do full color cover and all this content. But the way we really got traction with the magazine was that we would go every year to Gen Con.
Okay, where's upstairs? Does anybody have any idea?
Gen Con is the oldest tabletop role-playing game convention in the world. It's where if you make a physical product that rolls dice or uses cards or has a board, that's where you go to celebrate your hobby. And back then, magazines were the only way you got your information.
So we would drive up all these copies of the magazine, and we would hand out free copies, just giving them out to every gamer in line.
Oh, what's going on here? Let's take a picture. I want that evening. Oh, okay, no problem.
Gen Con was a place where you always saw the next big game, the next big breakout to happen.
It would have been Gen Con 87 that I first met Mark Reinhagen of Lion Rampant at the time. And Ars Magica was one of those little games from a little company that I found, and I was, blown away by it. It was very artful. The contents were spectacular.
Ars Magica was this phenomenal game that won all these awards. But at the time, we were not doing well. And I met Stuart, and he just seemed like the kind of rock-solid business guy.
These are serious fantasy game players who are here to assume the roles of imaginary characters in imaginary places.
The role-playing game industry at that point was tiny. So for financial reasons, Lion Rampant and White Wolf Magazine decided to merge. Mark at that point decided to move down to Atlanta, where the Wick brothers were.
Thought was that we were going to do everything we were doing already, but better.
White Wolf moves in the environs of Little 5 Points, which is this very bohemian, artist-friendly, countercultural cluster of the weird and alternative and misunderstood that lives in the middle of Atlanta. And so it's a perfect fit.
Everyone worked together and they lived together.
Your bedroom was your office?
Mark's bedroom was his office.
So the house was always a weird kind of eclectic mess of creative papers everywhere.
we're all stuck in this house together, and it was nuts.
So here's this little company with this really nifty, semi-successful independent game, and it's time for the annual pilgrimage to Gen Con.
You had to go through Indiana. You had to go through Gary, Indiana. I had never seen a place like it just looked like time forgot. Like it was the worst.
Wholesale urban decay brought about by the economic disaster that was the 70s and the 80s ruined a lot of people's lives. And that's what Mark saw in Gary. He saw the complete and utter disdain for humanity. We did that. You know, it wasn't the automotive companies that destroyed Rust Belt America. It was us. People. We let it happen.
I remember us saying, this place is bad. Who would live here? Mark was like, probably vampires.
Instantly, I knew, boom, you are the vampire. You were human. You've been fucked. Your life is over. It's this nightmare world. What are you going to do now? How are you going to survive? Everyone in the car went, what? Like back then, the idea of being a vampire was just impossible to imagine.
In role-playing games, vampires were monsters to be killed. Their lairs looted for treasure.
Vampires were always something in Dungeons and Dragons that you fought.
You know, and now it seems so normal and ordinary and such a plausible idea. But at the time, it was a definite glitch. Normally at Gen Con, which is the grade 1 convention, I was a party animal. I would party the whole time, right? This convention, I didn't party at all. I just sat and wrote and wrote and wrote. And it just all flowed out.
Playing the dark side takes me away from my ordinary life. You gotta explore the deprivation and violence that you don't do in your regular life. You don't have to actually expose yourself to those dangers, but you get to experience them. You can just get a bit of an understanding why you feel the way you feel or act the way you act by taking on a different role. I met a lot of people I've been friends with for years through LARPing. You get a thing that binds you together, this experience.
Masquerade clearly draws a lot of its inspiration from movies like The Lost Boys and Near Dark and The Hunger, the sort of vampire myths of the 80s. It also draws very heavily from sort of the entire spectrum of popular vampire mythology.
Vampires have been depicted differently in different eras. In the very earliest stories about vampires, folklore stories about vampires, vampires are not seductive and they are not appealing. Vampires are ghouls. Lord Ruthven is somebody who is handsome, he's personable, and yet ultimately he is revealed to be a top of the food chain predator. But Dracula really is ground zero for our contemporary conception of the vampire. He is where it starts, the idea of the seductive vampire, the appealing vampire, the vampire whose lust for human blood does not make him unwelcome in human company. Anne Rice's interview with the vampire was a real turning point for a number of reasons, but the single biggest one, I think, was that it pushed the sexuality of vampire stories even farther forward.
That, provided the contemporary idea of they were tragic, romantically cursed creatures, ones you could sympathize with and arguably want to be with.
I decided I would not read Anne Rice. I would not be tainted. Of course, what I didn't realize is that all these 80 vampire movies that I love so much all stole their stuff from Anne Rice.
Sleep all day, party all night, it's fun to be a vampire.
What Vampire did was it essentially took ownership of every previous vampire myth, said, if you're a fan of any of these things, come play in our world, because our world is the whole world.
After we got back from that Gen Con, Mark really started working on Vampire.
Stuart was very much the sounding board for me. His office was across the hallway from me, so I constantly burst in and go, what do you think of this idea? Okay, we're going to have clans, and these clans will be they'll be like character classes, but we're not going to do character classes. But they'll be like social groups, but they won't give you anything extra. But they will, but they won't. And, and he would go, that sounds good, Mark.
One of the most powerful design ideas in Vampire is the idea of clan.
Monster entertainment always, I think, has appealed to outsiders. But if you are slightly different in some manner in your real life, it's so nice to belong, to a clan or a pack and to have a clear purpose.
That idea that you would inherit a worldview and a political position and a history with your choice of character had never been expressed so fully and completely before.
When I first started in role-playing games, the biggest artists in the gaming industry at the time were like guys that did the D&D stuff, but they weren't very dynamic.
There was gaming art before Tim, and then there was Tim.
That was a lot of fun.
So many things before that were very high fantasy art to varying degrees of quality. You know, classic sword and sorcery, big guys in armor and dragons and women in chainmail bikinis.
Vampire was the first time where I really sunk, I mean, pardon the pun, I sunk my teeth into it. And it was the right subject matter at the right time for me. I immediately knew what I wanted to do. Instead of having this character on this page that feels like a comic book, what if I want to make them real? I want to make them possible.
He basically brought this real world grittiness that you could really believe because they were real people.
I would just get friends over. I would say, okay, who's going to be right for this character? And my friends were in these bands. It's my pal Sherry Wall. She's one of my favorite people on the planet. And yeah, there's a classic right there. That's Tim Schinkel. My best friend Joel, who modeled for everything for me for a long time. My pal Scotty Wilson. The absolute quintessential gypsy white trash vampire, Scott Wilson. Wow. So instead of having it be some count that lived in, Romania 400 years ago, I started with a different culture.
It immediately makes it like, wow, this is our vampires. I can be one. I can just go down to the club and be one.
I don't know whether or not I realized how big Vampire was going to be until these visuals came in, where I was like, this is cool on another level.
Tim Bradstreet's artwork was one of the best decisions we made.
The full pages were it. They were gothic punk. They expressed the moment of the time. They expressed characters. They were perfect. Funny thing is, we had no money left for a cover. We were screwed.
They had actually commissioned a piece of artwork, Vampire with a blood tear and a helicopter crash in the background and a motorcycle and stuff, and it was just, didn't really feel right. And I came up with the idea of wanting to do something that was a little more photographic and a little more, let people just put their own vision of what they thought vampires could be onto that.
So we got in his car, we bought a bunch of roses with the last dollars in my pocket, and we went to a stone place and we bought a piece of green marble. And we snapped that photo. And I am absolutely 100% convinced that it had a stupid, cheesy gamer, I'm a vampire. It wasn't the word.
The world was changing a lot. The sort of old guard Republicans in America were coming out of power. The Berlin Wall had just come down. Music was making this revolution. The sort of hair metal, poppy sheen of the 80s was fading away to the Seattle punk scene.
In the early 90s, there was an undercurrent of a need for change. There was a need for a dark voice, and those people with dark voices emerged.
1990 was the first time that you heard about it. Its first advertisement for this game called Vampire. It was just a big black paper with just white vampire across it.
When Vampire the Masquerade came out, I'd seen nothing like it. This beautiful green cover with a red rose across it, just absolutely beautiful. I had to pick it up. This is vampires and goth and punk. And that, of course, makes it vastly different from any role-playing game that has ever come before.
Here you are, an outsider, getting to play the ultimate outsider. That was that was catalytic for us.
It wasn't even really so much playing the vampire as becoming the vampire.
It's not just reading a novel about an anti-hero. Those moral ambiguities and moral challenges are yours now.
Suddenly, people who had never been interested in role-playing games before, or geek culture before, were interested. I remember working in the store after Vampire First Edition had come out. There was sort of a steady stream of, these sort of goth kids that were coming into the game store, which was weird, because they didn't buy anything else. They didn't socialize with anyone. They came in and they bought their White Wolf products and they left. They wanted to share this thing with us, this thing that we loved. It was a new sensation to be cool, or to at least to think you were cool.
In a very not progressive part of the United States, and didn't really have a lot of friends, so all of my spare time was spent reading books or drawing or doing all of these things that were kind of by myself and in my own head. And then when I finally met one or two people who actually played these things, it was like a whole other experience, because suddenly I was getting to hang out and be with people that were just as into these strange little ideas as I was. Looking at those books, like looking at every single little bit of that stark black and white, beautiful art with all the detail, like all that ink work, I was enthralled. It was just so, like, my imagination went everywhere, just getting to look at all of that stuff. It's not just, here is a mechanical system of numbers, but rather it's like, here's a way you can really collaboratively create some universe with each other.
Vampire had the artwork and the clan system and this idea that you're the monster, but what really made it revolutionary is that it shifted focus away from rules and dice towards storytelling.
Vampire was written differently than other role-playing game products. It was produced differently. It looked different. It read differently. It was not just a collection of numbers and statistics and tables for how to kill monsters or how to have a car chase.
When it came out, it was a revolution. This was during a time when games like Rollmaster were great, and they have just hundreds and hundreds of pages of tables that you go through and look through. We started realizing that what we felt was most powerful was the conversation. It wasn't really, can I jump between the buildings, roll the dice, and so on. That became more and more meaningless.
Horror fiction is really popular because it allows us to engage with a lot of big moral questions and these issues about humanity and often about belonging. And role-playing is a very good medium for exploring some of those dynamics specifically.
It's not an external force you're fighting, which you can kill with a sword or a fireball. It's the conflict within you, which makes it much more a psychological type of game.
It doesn't look very exciting. If you walk into a room and people are playing pen and paper, they're just sitting around. It's happening in this sort of shared imaginative space between all the players. And that means that you can't see it unless you're playing. It's all happening in their minds.
Head, come show me. Tilt down. Show me a whole business.
At Gen Con, game just explodes.
Day one of chaos.
I went over to the White Wolf booth and I was like, dude, how's it going for you guys? And they were like, it's nuts. It was crazy. White Wolf grew so fast. I mean, they literally went from being a garage company to $1 million company overnight.
People's appetite for the game was just voracious.
Growing from, living in a house together with our warehouse in the yard to, renting a warehouse building.
Vampire was taking the industry by storm, and we became known as a company that would throw the crazy parties.
The late night gothic punk scene in Atlanta was incredibly strong.
We went out every night. We were there in the clubs where this is happening, so it's informing the game. And you could not separate the game from club culture and club fashion.
It began to aggregate different looks of counterculture into one beautiful, blended Gothic punk aesthetic, which then in turn certainly began to appear everywhere else.
Stuff that was really niche all of a sudden became this sort of like bigger and broader subculture visual aesthetic.
Thousands of people, inarguably, were influenced by those classic vampire depictions of you can be this.
Vampires, we need werewolves.
Right.
Right, and so we're going to put ourselves on the spot. Here's the games we're going to make, and I guess we'll make them.
Now we got to make them.
We were really creating a world of darkness, and the idea was that in the world of darkness, these vampires existed side by side with these werewolves and these mages and the lingering after effects of ghosts. There were other games that kind of supposed different supernatural creatures would be in contact with one another, but the world of darkness idea that these all shared a world, that their societal structures overlapped one another and often intruded on one another. That's really, I think, what made the world of darkness stand out. At the same time, these live action rules for playing Vampire the Masquerade emerged.
first live-action role-playing game product was called the Mascarada. It was a big box set. There'd never really been a LARP product before. Once you actually had something on the shelf for people to buy next to the tabletop game, then it exploded. Then it got big.
LARP started out as an acronym for live-action role-playing. It's a form of role-playing where you embody the character, and very often you also dress up as your character and try to portray their actions as fully as possible.
LARP existed before this, but this is what made it huge, in the same way that like there was science fiction before Star Wars, and then there was Star Wars. All of a sudden, instead of like 5 or 6 people playing around a table, you had 15, 30, 60, hundreds playing in parks, college campuses, and nightclubs. It was more like an event.
Up until Vampire, most of the live-action games were people in a field or in a forest with padded foam swords running and chasing and hitting each other. The Vampire live-action game was more of a social drama.
All of a sudden, you have different people that place different values on what is gaming. What is a role-playing game?
We are all being hunted because we are one.
Completely changed the type of people that would play an event like that.
Calm down.
They were not traditional gamers. They were theater people. They cared about the narrative, the story, the drama. They wanted intensity.
What people get surprised by often is how powerful role-playing as a form is.
You make me this monster!
Everybody is creating the story every moment through the game. When you speak, you're creating it. When you are not speaking, you're also creating it. You're doing something kind of difficult and awesome together. You created this world and you made it real for a little while.
I thought the timing was perfect for this role-playing game. So I went to friends of mine and said, what do you guys think about transforming the world in Vampire into a living, breathing organization? Our interest was building a community.
Camarilla Fan Club was extraordinarily important. White Wolf was one of the very first role-playing game companies to have a dedicated fan club that would go out into the world and show people how cool their stuff was.
That was something that was really different with Vampire. We didn't build large communities around our D&D games, but when it became Vampire and then when it became live action, then all of a sudden we were bringing other people from other cities in.
We built a really easy point of entry for someone to get involved in the world of darkness, where friends would say, hey, we're doing this gaming event. Come with us, take a look and see what you think.
But it was people who were passionate about what they were doing, and so they continued to inspire other people to be passionate, and that was a big part of how the brand grew.
It grew so fast, we simply could not keep up with it. It was impossible to keep up with how fast it was growing. It's not only across cities, but across continents.
Camarilla Fan Club organized LARPs regularly. In Europe, it reached millions of people.
Vampire became more than a game. It became a culture that opened doors to different kinds of people with different ideas, but we were all joined by this common interest.
What I loved about the vampire culture was it didn't matter what gender you were, it didn't matter what color you were, it didn't matter what ethnic background or cultural background you came from, you were all a vampire.
I remember reading many Dungeons and Dragons books and not seeing a black person. World of Darkness was different.
What I find really cool about Vampire the Masquerade is that it created that foundation of equality.
I had a community, finally, that accepted me for what I am and allowed me to be what I want to be.
I have always been out of place. I never really fit in. You know, I was a gamer, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. And a friend of mine got me into Vampire back in '93. About, I'd say 2 years after that, we started getting into the LARP, which was recently released at that time. And we became the first Camarilla-based vampire group in San Diego. A lot of my close friends who I'm still friends with now, we start off in a vampire LARP. I like dressing up like a monster. It gives me more of an assertive feel. You know, I can go out and meet people and I can be myself because this is basically me. I realized that my friends were more family than anybody else. And I'm much happier that way.
No. Here it is, the White Wolf bus. Woo, down the bus road. Get the batteries? Oh, I got plenty of batteries.
Frankly, anywhere we went, there was a very different kind of fan that was around the White Wolf booth holding our games than you saw anywhere else in the convention hall.
Setting up the booth.
You know, when you're at an RPG convention, you're talking about magic and you're talking about, you know, knights hitting each other, and none of that is what, you know, the World of Darkness was about.
Going into a gaming environment was a boys' club. Vampire the Masquerade wasn't a boys' club.
I have people who to this day come up to me and say, man, I remember that Gen Con after you came out with Vampire. Suddenly, there were women at Gen Con.
It became inviting to girls because here were suddenly games that were about stories and characters and relationships.
They would come to the convention and go to no one else's booth except our booth.
Having almost a 50% ratio of women was unheard of in the role-playing scene.
It was big business at this point. You know, it was a serious competitor to D&D. You know, they had a goofy cartoon in the 80s, and all of a sudden we've got like primetime, you know, Fox show coming out after the X-Files.
I got a call, this guy, and he said, I'm so-and-so from Creative Artists Agency. We're the agency that does everything in Hollywood. And I invite Mark into the office and say, hey, Mark, this message, what do you think we should do with this? And he just goes running, screaming through the office, CAA called, they called.
This is what the Bruja clan will do to all you gangles.
The thing about it was that it was, it was an Aaron Spelling show. Strike number one.
You gangrels are cruising for Bruja. You chose the wrong place.
So Mark moved out there on the West Coast, and they were putting together the film deal with Spelling.
Every way I could, I tried to manipulate it to be a better show than Spelling wanted to be. But he got his sticky old hands all over it and just made it schlock.
It was still Vampire the Masquerade, you know, Prince of the City, the whole game, but I was really turned off by the show. I couldn't even watch all the episodes.
At that time, one of the big controversies that came up for White Wolf was a guy named Rob
out yourself, let them drink it. It runs through their veins for a few moments, and then your blood becomes tainted.
He murdered people in a sort of cult-like fashion.
Prosecutors plan to seek the death penalty against Rod Farrell.
And we were all like, oh, we're fucked.
The fact is that there's a whole vampire culture of people who wanted to dress like vampires, drink blood, and generally behave like vampires. And clearly, that caused a lot of consternation.
We had church leaders speaking out against us, political figures speaking out against us.
It was so absurd. The accusations from the media and from the state was ridiculous.
You know, horror has always been a problem for religious groups because clearly all of the horror creatures exist outside of God's universe. They're not God's creatures. God didn't make werewolves. God didn't make vampires. And it was clearly a thing that people found very disturbing.
For the murder of Richard Wendell, you are hereby sentenced to death.
We had nothing to do with him. He didn't even, by all accounts, play our games. At that point, there was a number of internal struggles between the development team in Atlanta that was making the games and Mark.
Mark had moved to California to open White Wolf West, and he was frequently in conflict with some of the more traditional business-minded people at the office. And there were also people who felt like that West Coast office was just bleeding money and they weren't generating anything.
One memory I have is that I just got back from Germany in this amazing trip, and I just ran 3 LARPs, and I come back to White Wolf straight from the airport. No one has any idea how exhausted I am or how little I slept. And I come in the warehouse, and the entire company, they all give me this look like, you fucking asshole.
The late 90s, and the entire tabletop industry was going through a fundamental shift. The entire publishing trade was being massively disrupted by digital entertainment.
These same problems in the book industry led to our main competitor at TSR, who ran Dungeons & Dragons, going bankrupt, and it nearly bankrupted us. We had layoffs. It was a hard time. And so in the middle of this atmosphere of hardship for the company, the West Coast office became a more difficult thing to keep going.
I just thought that you wouldn't want to get rid of the creator. But, you know, what I didn't realize, the entire company would want to get rid of the creator. Made me feel like shit. I mean, I hate that. I mean, as much as I'm always the outsider, as much as I'm always the guy who is not loved, you know, it destroyed me.
In 1998, White Wolf Publishing as a company was struggling, which is ironic because at the same time, vampire media and entertainment was booming. You had Buffy, you had From Dusk Till Dawn, and a lot of what you saw in those shows were influenced directly by the World of Darkness.
One of the great untold stories about early 21st century popular culture is really how much World of Darkness influenced the resurgence of vampire culture.
You better wake up. The world you live in is just a sugar-coated toppling. There is another world beneath it.
Blade came out in 1998, and that was basically based on Vampire.
Blade definitely was Vampire the Masquerade on steroids.
Blade. I
thought the trailers looked so fucking awesome. You know, I was excited to see the movie.
That's him! Get him! Fuck him up!
It didn't occur to me till I was watching the movie, and I'm like, oh, wow. That looks like a thing that I did, you know? And it was just where he stops at the end of that scene where he... And then, you know, there's Blade. And it was almost the exact same pose. A couple years later, I talked to the writer of the first movie. He's sitting next to me, and he says, you know, on Blade 1, dude, we totally had your art books. I'm like, you're kidding? Really? He goes, yeah, we had your portfolio, your vampire portfolio, we had your art book, and I was like, so you just borrowed my stuff and then you didn't hire me for that? And he's like, oh. I mean, Blade was a character before Vampire, of course, but when did Blade start to look really badass and take the safari jacket off, you know, and the green goggles? I rest my case. A little while later, I get a phone call from Guillermo del Toro. You know, I was like, you're Guillermo, aren't you? And he's like, yeah. He goes, listen, we're going to work together right now. I was like, right now? What do you mean? He goes, I've got a film, it's Blade 2. And I was like, oh, really? And he goes, and I'm going to make sure you get paid this time.
I would say after that, it I think became very problematic. Because after that, White Wolf, in a very real sense, in a very legal sense, went to war with the club.
White Wolf, the sort of rock and roll cultural mavens of the last decade, now became the guys that had lawyers and suits in a lawsuit with their fans.
When the lawsuit happened, the community was shattered.
Even though that White Wolf won that lawsuit, it really lost the court of public opinion.
That was the end of the Camarilla as we knew it. Some people were very hurt by it.
The response to that is you started to see sales just drop. People started to go away.
I saw that sales had gone down. I have friends who run these game stores, and they say, I'm not selling Vampire as much anymore.
We were used to selling tens of thousands of something, and now we're selling thousands.
You know, we knew that we made a game that was popular in the 90s. We also knew that role-playing games overall were declining. But what we didn't know at the time was it us or was it them? Like, was it a product problem or was it a market problem?
At this point, we had hundreds of books around Vampire the Masquerade, and we felt like we had explored so many of the topics that were there to explore that we were starting to move into minutia that only applied to a small group of people.
There was so much vampire stuff that we had created. This world was so rich, so developed. Right. Like new players were just too intimidated by, I have to know what? We decided we needed to restart, and I think then we decided the best way to do that was to sort of fulfill this inherent promise that we'd made from the very beginning. From 1991, you know, the advertising is Gehenna is coming.
Shine like the sun, shine like the moon. Gehenna is coming soon.
From 1991 on, we had said in our books at some point the elder vampires will wake up and they will be hungry, and it will fundamentally change the very existence and the nature of what it means to be a vampire.
Turn cold and unclean things will rise up from the earth, and storms will roll. Lightning will light fires, animals will fester, and their bodies twisting will fall.
It was the vampire apocalypse, we called it Gehenna.
And you know, this time, at Gehenna,
industry were like, whoa, you guys, like, that's radical.
Insane.
You're insane. You're taking, one of the most popular products in the marketplace, and you're just going to stop doing it.
When I started playing World of Darkness, my mom had gotten very sick. And I, had a lot of feelings about that I didn't really talk to people about. And so getting to play a character that maybe acted out or do stuff was a really great way of taking all of that emotional stuff and putting it into something. The first time I went, go into the room, have like a basic costume, like nothing really super cool, and I walk in and I see all these people and they're like engaged and doing stuff, and I chicken out and I turn around and I walk right back out. And I didn't say anything for like 30 minutes. And then people started talking to me and I was responding in character, and then all of a sudden I was just doing it. I felt exhilaration. It was awesome. It was very thrilling because it was scary too. It's intense and it requires a lot of social skills, actually. I learned so much about what I can do as a person, being able to play all these different roles, and I learned a lot about other people too. The World of Darkness and the LARP community, it's very close-knit. And for me, what is cool is involving people, telling really great stories, and making it fun.
The war itself had become more perilous. The weapons had evolved.
With all the upheaval that was going on at the time, the last thing that White Wolf needed was yet another legal battle.
Who are you people? You're in the middle of a war that's been raging for the better part of 1,000 years. A blood feud between vampires and lichens. Werewolves.
When I saw Underworld, I thought they must have contacted White Wolf and done this movie in association with them. I thought it was that close.
They essentially make a World of Darkness movie just straight up.
The chain has never been broken, not once, not in 14 centuries, not since we elders first began to leapfrog through time.
There's cases where we felt movies or other works had taken too much of our material, and Underworld was a good example of that.
Ah, yes. The lichen.
Underworld is a washed-down version of Mascarade. The whole vampire versus werewolf thing came from the World of Darkness.
We had a protracted legal fight, but we reached a satisfactory settlement on it, and the settlement allowed them to continue making the movies.
That was the only time that we were acknowledged. The rest of the time, we were just copied.
2006 to 2008, you saw the Twilight novels, the Sookie Stackhouse, Charlene Harris books. Those were very clearly influenced by World of Darkness.
When you came in, the air went out.
I think the greatest copy of Vampire the Masquerade was True Blood.
Anybody that saw True Blood first season thought that same thing, that knew about Vampire. They went, is this a new Vampire show? Is this a new White Wolf show?
The first vampire was Cain.
Being a vampire is the mark of Cain. It's God's punishment for bringing the first evil.
In the True Blood TV series, they actually talk about Cain, the first vampire. I mean, that was sort of a defining point of our myth.
Your Majesty, you've had me abducted by werewolves?
They had kings of different cities. We had princes. They had sheriffs. We had sheriffs.
Isabel was in fact kidnapped by human or vampire. I am duty-bound as sheriff of the area in which he resides to find him.
It had gotten to a point where they weren't even really pretending not to copy our stuff anymore.
In 2004, we relaunched the World of Darkness in what a lot of players call the new World of Darkness. It wasn't Vampire the Masquerade, it was Vampire the Requiem.
There was a lot of excitement looking forward to it, right, to it coming.
I was excited to see a reinvention of this world that I had grown to love. When I received the book, I started paging through it and did not speak to me at all.
Requiem emphasized less story and more rules and procedure.
Vampire became more gaming oriented and rules mongering than role playing and storytelling.
And that was a big departure for a lot of people. You know, Tim Bradstreet wasn't doing the art. The art was very comic book style.
If you look at Requiem more closely, if you look at the nuts and bolts of it, there is this huge change. Can be played to win.
When Vampire Requiem had come out, all of the people that I was playing the LARP with were like, what?
To me, Requiem was another role-playing game. And I love role-playing games, but it didn't speak to me like Masquerade did.
We sold more books with that launch than we had ever sold before on any other launch. 100,000 units, which for 2004 in the role-playing game industry, you might as well have parted the Red Sea. I mean, it was an incredible launch.
While they sold a lot of the core book, what was very telling is they didn't sell much of its companion books.
White Wolf with a new game. Who was not going to buy that book? Everyone was going to buy that book. But after that first book, I saw people were not as interested, and I thought, oh my goodness, maybe White Wolf just committed suicide.
What do you do in a situation like this? You know, you have fans who love the traditional World of Darkness, but they're not buying the game anymore. You attempt to launch a brand new version of it, no one's buying.
Games we can play.
One of the reasons that we weren't resonating with the youth of the role-playing game industry is because the youth weren't in this market. They had found another market.
Book publishing was dying. It was clear everything was moving electronic, and we were trying to basically create a property that would be exciting again.
Bloodlines truly captured the sense of story from the role-playing game and the live-action game. It was a new way to play something that we were already enthusiastic about.
Bloodlines is a game that was put out by Activision, and we were all excited about the potential. And so we felt like we needed to get into being our own development studio.
And that's when CCP steps into the picture.
The idea of Eve was that we would create a world with rules, and the players inside that world would then create the game.
How much? Don't tell me what you're looting. I don't want to know until after.
The game is about people interacting with other people.
Hold on, shut up.
EVE Online isn't massive. Multiplayer online game, which you play by logging on to an online server somewhere, and you start playing together with a lot of other people.
It felt like a perfect fit because what they were doing was completely based around stories that were driven by the community. And so we felt like this is exactly where we want to be.
I met Hilmer for the first time at E3 in 2006. And at one point, Hilmer just says, everybody keeps talking to us about, merging and working with CCP, but it's like they want to add Coca-Cola with Coca-Cola. You're like a cheeseburger. We would go great together.
Here comes this odd Icelandic company that makes this weird space game. They sort of are seen like the great white hope, so to speak, that are going to come in and save everything and make it awesome again, make it bigger and better than ever.
You owe it all to this guy.
For me, it was huge because I'd always been a fan of World of Darkness. I was really interested in revitalizing a lot of the things that were now struggling at White Wolf.
We went through the entire merger and acquisition process in 4 months. It was like drinking from a fire hose that was full of Icelandic vodka.
Hardcore fans is like, where's the stuff? Here, have our money. But nothing was really happening, so that was frustrating.
At this point, White Wolf's community was a mess. You had a lot of resentment. Again, there was these broken promises. So the idea was sort of get them all together. 1,300, 1,400 fans of different fan clubs, all in the same room.
So we put something together just for you guys. This was made to capture the mood and the feel that we're going to try to pursue with the World of Darkness MMO.
You won't believe me. In fact, I shouldn't tell you. Some secrets are best taken to the grave. They're all around us. They control everything. They have always been here, waging their secret wars.
The big question up to that point was, which version of the World of Darkness are they going to make?
So behind the scenes, we've been working on it for 3 years, and we still have a very long way to go. So that brings me to the announcement that I know a lot of you guys have been speculating about for a long time, which is what version of what White Wolf product is this game going to be based on? And the answer is...
You thought you were at a rock concert.
That was the moment when I realized, holy shit, they're bringing it back. It's coming back.
When they said that, I felt role-playing games matter again to me.
This was the ultimate validating, holy shit moment. We're going back to what's awesome. We're going to spend millions of dollars on the franchise you grew up with, you loved.
It was terrifying and exciting and cathartic. We are going to be able to walk into a living, breathing digital world, and it was going to be glorious.
And it was huge. The level of excitement, all the old grievances that have swept away. We announced we were going to do this 20th anniversary printed book. Tim Bradstreet was going to come back and do the art.
Doing V20, for me, it was revisiting, an ex-lover in a way. here we are. We're going to go down this road again. And it had been a while. Felt great.
People had gotten a book back in their hands the way they did originally. They got to share stories and reconnect with old friends.
Even though traditional role-playing games were far less popular than they had been in the 90s, people who were fans were still playing these games. And LARPing was super popular all around the world during that whole period.
There was a community aspect to playing this game that really transcended just fun and escapism.
What's special about role-playing is that you have a very clear purpose, typically, and you very often have a strong sense of belonging. The characters are very rarely isolated, and that can be quite liberating, I think.
Storytelling is the currency of human contact, and that is exactly the very heart of what role-playing is.
Even if you don't necessarily even know your co-players, you do belong to this collective, and it has this sort of transformational potential for everybody. And so you get so caught up in the moment that you forget that you don't think you have leadership skills, and you stand up and lead. And then after the event, you're like, wait, what? Like, I was a leader? And that's still something that you did. Nobody can take that away from you.
Making video games is really hard. It's really hard. And making an MMO is even harder on top of that because of the sheer volume of systems and scope of those systems and players who need to be put in contact with one another.
We knew this, but it was also kind of a mantra within CCP. We know this is going to be incredibly hard, but impossible is nothing. You know, we eat the impossible for breakfast. You know, we did Eve, and we're going to do this.
MMO, a lot of what the creative director wanted was players to be able to express themselves visually, and the idea here was that players would be able to wear whatever they wanted, so visually they could create this look for them. So we had multiple fashion designers working at CCP.
CCP approached me to bring me on as a designer because they wanted to honor the tradition of World of Darkness and its aesthetic, but at the same time push it forward. My aesthetic is very tribal. It has goth elements to it. I gravitate towards the darkness. I came on as the role of digital fashion editor, where I worked with a team of illustrators and we created fashion collections that represented each of the clans. I thought it was just such an incredible world. This is the first jacket that has ever been created digitally from an actual fashion piece. We took this jacket and we put it into the World of Darkness environment where the characters were able to wear the jacket within the gaming setting. We were able to digitally make everyone's fantasy and something that you would dream of wearing in real life.
I like to be complimented.
I like to be told how awesome I am and, you know, I'm cool. It's ever since I was a really little kid, it's always been about putting on the costume. When I start to put on the costume, I start to kind of just distance myself from myself. It's always fascinating when I realize I can see the moment when it has clicked that I have transitioned from Caroline to the character. Sometimes it's a very noticeable click almost, like switching the channel on a TV. With Requiem, I like to play the more apologetic monster. I don't necessarily enjoy what I do, but a girl's gotta eat. With Masquerade, there is so much more opportunity for me to decide that I'm a monster and I feel good about it. And some days I want to explore a part of me that I might shy away from or that I don't quite understand why I'm like that, and LARP gives me a cheaper alternative to therapy to explore myself.
Role-playing has a long history of being used as therapy, Gestalt therapy, from I think it was in the 20s or 30s where it first started being used, like in the sense of be your mother as she leaves your father and try to understand it through that. That's role-playing.
There are therapeutic methods that look a lot like role-playing, and you never know which random moment in this LARP or role-playing game is going to resonate with something in your life, that suddenly something in your mind clicks and you're like, hey, this reminds me of that thing. If you're not prepared for that, then it can be a little scary.
Something so deep, so dark, so personal, in that intimate kind of a way, you carry that with you wherever you are.
Was the economic engine that drove the company. CCP had raised capital to develop 2 new projects, Dust 514 in its Shanghai office and World of Darkness in its Atlanta office.
The problem starts when Eve starts to lose subscribers. Now we're seeing a trajectory where it's not really going up and it's just going down. So we're like, whoa, so we need to do something about this. So basically, all teams in all continents go to work on Eve.
CCP was a good company to work for. But once you sell something to someone else, it's theirs. White Wolf was now a part of that company. And White Wolf's needs were subservient to CCP's at that point.
All of the resources we needed to make the World of Darkness MMO were actually being taken away from us, and our project was suffering for it.
The following news that we got was that workers at White Wolf is fired. So we were like, okay, this is bad, probably.
You don't come back from that. You know, yes, it took a few more years for the project to get shut down completely, but that's the point where the company, basically, the fans, I think, just didn't believe it.
The decision, comes to shut it down. And I'm part of that decision. I was on the executive board, who made that decision. You could say I killed it, but
I felt a huge amount of responsibility towards the fans, and I still do. I mean, it made me feel terrible to feel like all these people had put in so much effort and time and belief and faith. It made me feel terrible.
The day they canceled the MMO, it felt like, okay, this is the end.
World of Darkness helped some of us geeks come to terms with being who we were, and that hadn't happened before.
Created a complete cultural movement. It was something that opened people's eyes to being able to express yourself in a whole different way.
You know that feeling you've had when you've walked out of certain movies and you just feel different? As an entity, it exists in that way. And it's pretty special. It's a very special thing.
When you have somebody come up to you and say, I read your book, it changed my life. You're just humbled by that. Like, it's just like writing the books changed our lives too.
We Ravnos are so few now. We're so very few, very few, very few. But we are strong. And we are clever. And when we band together, we are a force to be reckoned with. Our hope is to rise again, to reignite that passion that we used to feel, and to drink in a new generation.
It's just time for there to be a new expression of the World of Darkness in a way that will capture the imagination of millions of fans.
Different groups of people that you'd never get to meet if you didn't play the game. So it's a beautiful thing.
As soon as you join in, the community is lovely. You find this really broadening network that you can connect with.
Role-playing has changed my life in so many ways. It brings a sense of understanding between people. That's why we're here, right?
We just have it in us, this quest and this thirst for darkness. And I think the World of Darkness really brings out other parts of who we are and who our souls are.